You burn something and you send the smoke up. God gets a crack at determining the quality of your offering, the quality of your sacrifice. Well, let's be perfectly clear about this. If your sacrifices aren't first rate, the nature of your relationship with the infinite is going to suffer dreadfully. And that's exactly what the story of Cain and Abel reveals. Now, Abel, he's a trusting character. He believes in the nature of experience and the nature of existence. When he's called on to make a sacrifice, he sacrifices the best that he has to offer. And that makes God happy. And as a consequence, everything that Abel touches turns to gold. Everyone likes him. They respect him. His crops multiply. He's successful with women. Plus, he's a wonderful guy. So you could hardly imagine a more annoying creature if you possibly attempted to do it. Whereas Cain has reacted to his self-consciousness by withdrawing from the infinite. And there's a tremendous danger in that, because it starts to mean that he relies purely on his own devious devices to sail his ship through the shoals of life. He believes, as his arrogance develops, as a consequence of his withdrawal from the infinite, a contact that he can't tolerate because he can't tolerate his own vulnerability, that he's able to deceive the structure of reality itself, to offer second-rate sacrifices to God himself, who can see absolutely everything, because the infinite is absolutely everything, and to prevail nonetheless. Well, needless to say, this does not work. And it doesn't work in an obvious way. If you talk to people and they reveal to you their unnecessary suffering, it's very straightforward to look behind what it is that they have to say. They'll tell you the poor decisions they made in their lives, and the opportunities that they didn't take, and the chances that they didn't have enough courage to grasp, and the sacrifices they failed to make. There's nothing mysterious about it. And their own experiences teach them full well that they pathologize the relationship they have with the nature of reality. Well, that's a terrible thing. Well, and Cain is dreadfully unhappy. He's unhappy because nothing he ever wants happens, and that's partly because he doesn't really want it, because if he really wanted it, he'd make the right sacrifices. The salt is rubbed into his wounds by the existence of his brother, for whom everything seems simple, but of course really isn't. Cain goes to complain to God. And I had to read 3 or 4 different translations of these particular verses to figure out what this meant. And he says, what in the world is going on here? I'm working myself to the bone. I'm sacrificing things left, right, and center. Everything I touch turns to dirt. Everything turns against me. Like, what's up with the nature of reality? Cain's essential vulnerability is revealed and exacerbated by his pathological attitude towards his own actions. God says to him, essentially, sin is a predatory cat that crouches at your doorway and leaps on you at will. But if you only wanted to, you could master it. And that is absolutely the last thing that Cain wants to hear. Because if things are going from bad to worse for you, and you're playing a causal role in it, there's nothing more horrible than that someone can do to you, but reveal to you in a way that you can't deny that you're entirely complicit in your own demise. And that's exactly what God does to Cain. And so what does Cain do? Well, the logical thing would be listen, because if the structure of reality itself tells you something, it's best to listen, since there's no way out of it. But that's not what Cain does. He's so incensed by his sensual vulnerability, compromised and exacerbated by his failure to make the appropriate sacrifices and to conduct himself appropriately, that he decides then and there, number one, to destroy his ideal, to reduce the tension that he feels when that ideal exists as a contrast point, and number two, to destroy the favored son of God. And so he goes out into the field and kills Abel. And God comes along and says, where's my favorite son? And Cain says, I killed him. And it's so interesting to me that that story is placed, really, it's the third story in the Old Testament. It's with the archaic stories. And it's a story that reveals, as far as I can tell, that there are 2 essential patterns of reaction to the self-conscious, vulnerable conditions of existence. And one is humble approach to infinity with determined attempts to make the appropriate sacrifices. The other is arrogance, resentment, the keeping of everything good for oneself, and the degeneration of the soul into something that's homicidally murderous. Well, the story doesn't stop there, and it gets really compressed in this part, and that's perhaps because some of it's been lost with the passages of time. But the next thing that happens is that, well, God doesn't punish Cain. And you think, That's kind of strange. I mean, the Old Testament God, he's punishing people left, right, and center. It's right. Why not Cain? And you think, well, he marks Cain and he says to the people who are around that they should leave him alone because he's been marked by God as to be left alone. And the reason for that, I think, and this is something that's reflected on our legal system, is that murder promotes revenge. And revenge destroys societies. And so God puts an end to the situation right there and then by telling people that despite the fact that Cain has committed a terrible crime, that there will be no retribution. Cain goes off and gets married. And he has a number of generations of offspring. If you insult a member of the first generation of Cain's offspring, he doesn't kill you, he kills 7 of you. And if you insult a member of the second generation of Cain's offspring, he doesn't kill 7 of you, he kills 7 times 7 of you. And then on down the road of the offspring of Cain is Tubal-Cain. And Tubal-Cain is the artificer of weapons of war. And this stunningly brilliant story says in its incredibly compressed fashion that the motivation that drives the commission of the worst human atrocities is an inevitable social consequence of the refusal of the self-conscious individual to make the sacrifices appropriate to establishing a harmonious life and their consequent degeneration into a kind of murderous and resentment-filled rage, propagating endlessly through its variations in society until everything comes to an end. And the next story is the flood. And it's not surprising, because if things go from bad to worse long enough, everything falls. And it's a terrifying story, and I didn't understand that story. I didn't understand that story for years. It wasn't really until I read Alexander Solzhenitsyn that I developed, I think, the cognitive capacity to even understand what the story meant, because Solzhenitsyn said in his Nobel Prize accepting speech, a single person who stops lying can bring down a tyranny, which is a stunning thing to say, but I would also say something that's been amply demonstrated in the 20th century, because we have historical examples of people who did precisely that. Gandhi did it, Václav Havel did it, Nelson Mandela did it. Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago was definitely one of the axe blows that brought down the Soviet Union. A stunning achievement for a person who started writing that book by memorizing it when he was a concentration camp victim this far away from starvation. It shows you, as clearly as anything possibly can, how powerful the human spirit can be if it's willing to take on the obligation of its relationship with the divine. And also how terrible things can become if the responsibility of that burden is not shouldered. It's no wonder, as far as I can tell, that people don't think this way, because thinking this way it's catastrophic in a way. Because the burden it places on the individual is so extreme that it's almost unbearable. But that's exactly why it is in Genesis to begin with that Adam hides when he becomes conscious of his own vulnerability. It's like he thinks, well, a creature such as I could never bear such a burden. Well, there's a lot more to people than meets the eye. And the only way I learned that was by looking at people's and my own capacity for evil, because I started to realize that we regard ourselves as narrow little beings in a particular kind of box. And there's real comfort in that, although there's tremendous limitation. You cannot see your way out of that box until you know what I teach my students. I teach them about Nazi Germany, and I try to make them understand that there's an overwhelming probability, if they were in Nazi Germany in the 1930s, that they would have been perpetrators and Nazis. An overwhelming probability. And if they can't accept that, because it's a historical fact, they have absolutely no idea who they are. Now, imagining yourself as a Nazi perpetrator is an unbearably terrifying thing to do, but I don't believe that you can do, I don't think that you have any insight whatsoever into your capacity for good until you have some well-developed insight into your capacity for evil. Because people can tell you till they're blue in the face about your capacity for good. It just sounds like, wishful thinking. It sounds like the sort of thing that an advertiser might tell you on TV. It's just too good to be true. And I don't think people believe it. But I think that if you tell people that, in the cold, dark corners of their mind, there are motivations that are so terrible that they would traumatize themselves if they were ever revealed, that everyone knows at some level of analysis that that's absolutely true. But you think there's evidence throughout history that it's possible for people to be enlightened. And you'd think, since enlightenment is viewed as the medication for vulnerability and death, that everybody would be struggling as hard as they possibly could to be enlightened, if such a state exactly and precisely exists. But if the barrier to enlightenment is the development of self-consciousness of the individual human's infinite capacity for evil, then you can be immediately convinced about why enlightenment is in such short supply. When I finished my first provisional examination of the sorts of motivations that drove people to set up concentration camps and to torture people terribly in those camps, I came to a terrible conclusion. It was a conclusion that I think in some ways was the worst thing that had ever happened to me, maybe intellectually and morally. I came to understand why it is that people depended on their group identity and their cultural identification, because that helped protect themselves from their own vulnerability. You have to believe things because you just don't know everything. So you have to believe things. They fill in the gaps. The beliefs fill in the gaps. If the beliefs are stripped from you, then your defenses against the infinite are stripped, and it's no wonder that people will defend their beliefs. I thought, well, if you're too involved in defending your beliefs, you're going to be willing to kill other people in their defense. And we're so technologically powerful now that we can no longer be willing to kill other people in the defense of our own beliefs, because the time for that is past. And I realized, well, if you don't stand up for your beliefs, you leave yourself bereft, you're open to the depredations of the infinite. That's equally intolerable. It seems to leave no way out. There is a way out, and I think it's the way out that genuinely religious people have tried to offer humanity for thousands and thousands of years. And the way out of the conundrum posed to you by your reliance on ideological beliefs and your vulnerability in the face of the unknown is the development of a truly integrated and powerful character. And that's individual development. And it means constant confrontation with things you don't understand and constant attempts to ensure that your character is composed of truth and solidity rather than deceit, and to make of yourself something that's built on a rock and not predicated on sand. And the thing is, it's one thing to tell people that because maybe they should take care of themselves. But I don't know if that's enough to tell people because they don't take care of themselves that well. But it's a completely other thing to say, look, every time you make a pathological moral decision, you move the world one step closer to complete annihilation. And I absolutely believe that. I think the historical evidence is crystal clear. And I also think that every time you make an appropriate moral decision and you manifest moral courage in the face of your own vulnerability, then you move the world one step farther from the brink. And that's the case for every single person. Solzhenitsyn said, drawing on his Eastern Orthodox Christian background, every single person is the center of the world, a center of the world, not the center of the world. The world's a complicated place. It can have all sorts of centers. It's hard to believe that you might be one of them, but everything about human existence is hard to believe. The fact that it's here at all is hard to believe. The nature of it's hard to believe. Everything that human beings does is so ridiculous and remarkable that it's a consistently and constantly unfolding miracle. The idea that each of you might be a center of the cosmos in that infinite admixture of ridiculousness and absurdity is hardly more than one more ridiculous thing to swallow. Well, I'll summarize, I guess. I said that tragedy is a precondition for being. Being is the interplay between the finite and the infinite, and in that interplay there's tragedy, and there's no way out of that. Evil's something different. Evil's the conscious attempt to make the conditions of existence more pathological than they have to be. And it's motivated by conscious intent. The motivations arise because people pay a terrible price for their self-conscious awareness, and that awareness is their awareness of their vulnerability. And that is a terrible thing to be aware of. That vulnerability can be confronted forthrightly, accepted, and the appropriate decisions made. Alternatively, people can retreat into their own rationalistic arrogance and attempt to deceive themselves and everyone else about the nature of their own existence and about the nature of reality. That pathway leads to nothing but destruction. I think that there's good reason to assume that it's too late in our developmental course as a species for that path to be acceptable anymore, because we're too powerful. And if too many people stay on that path, we're going to do ourselves in. And so I would say, as we've become more technologically powerful, an increasing moral burden is being placed on each of us. It matters to the destiny of the cosmos whether or not you get your moral act straight. And I don't mean that in a trivial way. I believe that that's as close to an empirical fact as anything that can be demonstrated. And I also believe that's as terrifying a thing to consider as anything you could possibly imagine. And maybe it's too much to ask of people. But you know, our great religious traditions do continually remind us that inside every human being there's a spark of divinity. And that idea is a precondition for our entire system of law. There's always the possibility that it's true. And if it's true, it means that there's an infinite avenue of potential that lays open to every single person, and that the ability to transform the terrible conditions of reality into something not only acceptable but worthy of celebration actually lies within our grasp. And the alternative to that is the continual generation of a kind of hell that's so incomprehensibly awful that by any reasonable person's standards, it has to be regarded as something to avoid.